Sometimes, the deepest humiliation isn't a shout across the room, it's the moment you realize no one ever planned to hear you speak. She had prepared for weeks. Every line, every law, every precedent. But what she couldn't prepare for was the silence that followed her truth. Not the respectful kind. The kind that erases you while you're still talking. They didn't call her a liar. That would have been easier. They just talked over her, laughed near her, and then moved on as if her expertise, her decades, her life's work had been nothing more than background noise in someone else's performance. But what they forgot, what they always forget, is that not everyone raised in silence stays quiet forever. And the day someone chose to listen, everything shifted. Because sometimes it only takes 5 minutes for a voice long ignored to reshape the entire room. The room wasn't designed to hold dignity. Not really. It was built to hold power. Wood-paneled walls, American flags drooping behind leather chairs, the faint hum of cameras capturing every blink. This was Washington's theater of civility, where lawmakers wore decorum like a costume, and truth was often asked to wait its turn. Miss Evelyn Katzen had sat in this exact seat before. She had testified 5 times before Congress, and each time she had come prepared, every footnote sourced, every answer rehearsed. But what she could never prepare for was the silence that followed her voice. Not a respectful silence, not a contemplative one, a dismissal, an absence. A vacuum so thick it made her question if her words ever left her mouth at all. She was a regulatory scholar, a by-the-book policy architect who had spent decades navigating the tangled lines between legislation and implementation. But in this room, she was just a witness, a formality, a body placed under oath, waiting to be interrupted. And today, it didn't take long. "Miss Katzen," Lauren Boebert began, her voice sharp enough to slice through pretense. "Should bureaucrats implement rules and regulations that are not delegated by Congress?" Evelyn opened her mouth gently. "Well, it's not the bureaucrats that do it, it is or it isn't," Boebert cut in. Evelyn blinked. "Agencies are tasked with. Should they be in charge of enforcing rules not delegated to them?" Her tone was less inquiry, more accusation, a cross-examination disguised as curiosity, and Evelyn, with all her training, all her discipline, remained composed. She answered. She clarified. She did not flinch, but the message was clear. This was not a conversation, it was a spectacle. "You said agencies only do what Congress delegates, but the ATFs made 3 changes in 5 years. That's not delegation, that's dictatorship," Boebert sneered. Evelyn's hands remained folded on the table. "In each case, Congress provided statutory authority. The courts." "You're dodging." "I wasn't finished. It's my time." Evelyn leaned back slightly. Not in retreat, in restraint. What the cameras didn't show, what they never showed, was the way this kind of push felt. Invisible, but heavy. Not quite loud enough to provoke outrage, but sharp enough to leave a mark. It was the sly insinuation that she wasn't being honest, that her years of work were bureaucratic cover for corruption, that her expertise was meaningless because it didn't align with political theatrics. And then, the low blow came. Boebert referenced her home. "Well, the Sackett family doesn't live in a $2.5 million home like yours, Miss Katzen. Must be nice to avoid red tape." There it was. Not just a policy jab, but a personal one. One meant to paint her as elite, detached, even suspicious. The unspoken charge. "You are not one of us." The air grew thick. Evelyn didn't respond. She wasn't allowed to. Boebert kept talking. The chairman looked away, and across the aisle, several members sat comfortably, satisfied that the message had landed. It didn't matter that Evelyn had taken out 2 mortgages to care for her mother dying of bone cancer, or that her home, yes, $2.5 million on paper, was a product of California real estate inflation, not extravagance. None of that mattered in this room. Because in this room, context was inconvenient, truth was optional, and compassion was off the record. What Evelyn did next was simple. She straightened her back, crossed her ankles beneath the table, tilted her head slightly toward the chair, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of agreement. It wasn't even polite. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see what this is, I've seen it before, and I will not give you what you came for." But make no mistakes, he felt the push. She always did. The push that told her, "You don't belong here. Your knowledge is conditional. Your presence is tolerated. Your silence is preferred." And she would have stayed silent. She always had. Until, unexpectedly, something shifted. The chair struck the gavel. The time expired, and the air paused, not cleared, just paused. Then came the voice from the other side of the aisle, calm, centered, measured, but unmistakably alive. "Miss Crockett of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes." The camera turned. The room blinked. And Evelyn Katzen looked up, not because she expected to be defended, but because something in Jasmine Crockett's presence didn't feel like politics. It felt human. But that comes later. For now, the invisible push had done its job. It had drawn the line, reinforced the hierarchy, and reminded everyone watching, especially Evelyn, that not all voices are welcome equally. That truth must be vetted through the lens of power before it's allowed to be heard. But what this room forgot, what it always forgets, is that some pushes don't silence. They awaken. And in 5 minutes, it would learn the difference. The silence in the room didn't end when Lauren Boebert stopped speaking. It lingered, like smoke after a small fire, the kind that doesn't destroy the house, but leaves its scent on everything inside. Evelyn Katzen adjusted her posture, a minor movement that no one noticed. She'd learned over time how to vanish in plain sight. The trick wasn't to be invisible, it was to look just composed enough that no one thought to ask how much it hurt to be ignored. This wasn't new. Evelyn had been testifying before government panels for over 2 decades, quietly, faithfully, always with the same manila folders, the same annotated margins, the same dry sense of hope that if she explained it well enough this time, maybe someone would care about the fine print. But the truth was simpler. They didn't come to hear her. They came to speak at her. And so, she became practiced at disappearing behind the curve of her own professionalism. It wasn't always this way. Evelyn had once believed in policy as a form of protection, a shield built from logic, designed to serve the people who couldn't afford lobbyists or lawsuits. She entered government work through a fellowship at 19, after watching her father's rural grocery store collapse under a zoning regulation no one could explain. She'd promised herself then that she would learn the language of legislation, not to wield it but to translate it for those without power. But somewhere along the way, the system had become something else. Committees turned into stages. Hearings turned into battles. And truth? Truth became background noise, tolerated, but not necessarily welcomed. The older Evelyn got, the more she noticed the choreography, the pre-written questions, the cameras angling for a viral clip, the same members showing up late and leaving early. And always, the women like her were the ones expected to hold composure, to smile after being corrected, to thank the chair even after being dismissed mid-sentence. That smile, it wasn't politeness, it was armor. Her husband once called it her soft shield. "You use it to hold back the real storm," he told her years ago, when she'd come home after a brutal budget hearing and cried in the kitchen with her coat still on. Now she wore that smile like a professional obligation. But behind it lived a growing ache, not of rage, not even of fear, just erosion. Each time she was interrupted, something small wore away. Each time her data was ignored in favor of a soundbite, something delicate cracked. And each time her ethics were questioned, while the loudest voices never faced accountability, she felt another inch of space open between herself and the system she once trusted. And yet she stayed. Not because she believed in the perfection of the process, but because she believed someone had to remain within it, still honest, still tethered to truth, even if that truth had to whisper. So she returned, hearing after hearing. She watched men with half her experience lecture her on legal interpretation. She watched women, younger and louder, gain applause for weaponizing outrage. And she sat through moments like today, being accused of elitism for owning a home she barely finished paying off, being told that decades of regulatory research were nothing more than red tape, being reduced to a punching bag in a room that pretended to care about order. There was one hearing she remembered vividly. It had been years ago, an environmental committee discussing rural water contamination. She had testified alongside a man who'd come all the way from West Virginia with a mason jar of brown tap water. During the break, he turned to her and said, "You talk like you're not mad. I don't know how you do that." Evelyn had looked at him, her eyes soft. "Because if I show them I'm angry, they'll stop listening, and I came here to be heard." He'd nodded, then added, "But you deserve to be mad." She had never forgotten that, because she did. And yet, she chose every time to channel that anger into clarity, into citations, into carefully worded testimony they couldn't easily distort. That was her resistance, not in volume, but in vigilance. Still, there were days when the toll showed up in other places. In the way she clenched her jaw during small talk, in the insomnia that visited the night before every testimony, in the quiet despair she felt when her emails went unanswered not by aides or interns, but by elected officials who'd once promised to prioritize science, only to prioritize visibility instead. And today was no different. After Boebert's attack, Evelyn knew she wouldn't get a chance to clarify. The gavel had already moved the discussion forward. The room had turned its gaze elsewhere. The damage had been done, and the record would now reflect a lopsided exchange where her silence would look like concession, not containment. But what the record couldn't show, was the weight behind her silence. That behind the calm smile sat a woman replaying every classroom she'd ever stood in, every spreadsheet she'd ever stayed late to finish, every line of policy she'd tried to shape in the name of public good, and wondering, again, if it would ever be enough. Because somewhere deep inside, Evelyn still hoped, still believed that someone in the room was listening, still believed that clarity could carry weight even when it didn't make headlines. And maybe that's why she kept showing up. Not to be applauded, not even to be believed, but to hold the line for as long as she could against a tide that made truth feel expendable. That smile on her face wasn't surrender, it was survival. And as she sat waiting for the next speaker to begin, as her eyes drifted toward the woman from Texas who had just been recognized, she felt something unfamiliar ripple through the air. Not noise, not confrontation, but presence. Jasmine Crockett hadn't spoken yet, but Evelyn could sense it. This wasn't going to be politics as usual. There was something in the stillness, a pause with purpose, the kind that suggested maybe, just maybe, someone had finally been paying attention. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn's smile changed just slightly. It softened, not because she felt lighter, but because something heavier might finally be shared. The gavel landed with its usual practiced thud, like a punctuation mark on a sentence no one wanted to finish. The gentlewoman from Texas is now recognized for 5 minutes. Jasmine Crockett sat forward slowly, the way someone might approach a wound not with haste, but with understanding. She had been watching, listening, the whole time. And though she had not spoken a word yet, the room seemed to know something had shifted. She adjusted her microphone, glanced at the chairman, then turned not to Lauren Boebert, not even to the cameras, but to Miss Evelyn Katzen. Her voice came not like a wave, but like a current, low, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Let me begin," she said, "by doing what should have been done from the start. Miss Katzen, I apologize." The words were simple, but in this room, simplicity was power. Jasmine continued, "What you just experienced was not questioning. It wasn't oversight. It was performance, and I know what it feels like to be the backdrop to someone else's show." Evelyn didn't nod, but she didn't need to. The entire room felt the release like a breath had been held too long and finally let go. Jasmine turned back to the chair. And now, Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow, I'll reclaim my time to say something real. There was no objection. The silence in the room wasn't the kind that follows a threat. It was the kind that follows truth before anyone's ready to admit it. She shifted gears, not emotionally, but rhetorically. "Let's be clear," Jasmine said. "I come from Texas. I've passed more than one bar exam. I've sat in state houses where regulations meant the difference between a family keeping their home or losing it to a corporate loophole." She wasn't angry. She wasn't theatrical. She was surgical. "And I own guns," she added. "Democrats do. Texans do. Black women do. So spare me the monologue that regulation is the enemy of liberty." No one interrupted. Not because they agreed, but because something more compelling had entered the room: coherence. Jasmine leaned in, her tone sharpening not with heat, but with clarity. "You say the ATF went too far, but let's look at the pattern. You're not mad that they overreached. You're mad that they reached at all. That's the difference." Across the aisle, faces stiffened. Laptops suddenly looked more interesting, but she wasn't aiming at them anymore. She was aiming at the public memory. "I heard someone say, red tape kills innovation. Let me tell you what red tape saved in Texas. When our state grid collapsed during that winter storm, people died. Not because we lacked power, but because we refused regulation." Her voice dropped. "I got sworn into office that same week, and the first call I took wasn't from a donor or a lobbyist. It was from a woman whose elderly father had frozen to death in his trailer. You want to talk about government overreach? Let's talk about government negligence." The room was utterly still. Evelyn Katzen sat upright, not guarded, not tense, but attentive. Something in her posture had loosened. She was no longer the only voice trying to speak in full sentences. Jasmine continued, her cadence careful. "I've read the Clean Water Act. I've read the rulings. I know what it says, and I know what it was supposed to mean. But let's stop pretending that complexity equals corruption. The law evolves. It always has. That's what interpretation is." She didn't name Lauren Boebert. She didn't have to. Her entire tone was a refusal to dignify noise with direct response. Instead, she elevated the discourse above it. "I came here today prepared to ask questions. I came here prepared to listen. But instead, what I watched was someone turn this forum into a courtroom drama without the facts." A pause. She breathed in, measured, and the witness was treated like the accused. At that, even the chairman looked down. No script could fix that. Jasmine pivoted, offering something the other side rarely did: context. "You want to talk about the Second Amendment? Fine. But let's talk about all of it, not just the parts you like. It begins with a well-regulated militia. Remember that? No laughter, no sarcasm, just wait. Regulation is not the opposite of freedom. It's the condition that makes freedom sustainable." Then she turned back to Evelyn, not as a gesture but as a statement. "And for what it's worth, I didn't plan to go there today. But when truth is twisted in front of you, silence becomes complicity, and I won't be complicit." Evelyn's eyes met hers. For the first time, the line between witness and representative dissolved. They were simply two women in the same storm, refusing to drown quietly. Jasmine checked her time, then looked again at the chair. "I yield the rest of my time," she said, "but I'd like to offer it to the witness. She deserves the floor more than I do today." It was unprecedented. Not just the gesture, but the tone. It wasn't charity, it was correction. Correction without cruelty. The chairman hesitated, glanced around, and nodded. "The witness may proceed." Evelyn blinked, stunned, but she nodded slowly and leaned toward the microphone. The curtain hadn't just slipped. It had been pulled back. Not with anger, not with spectacle, but with something this chamber rarely rewarded: grace. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a mirror held up to a system that often forgot how deeply its own reflections mattered. There was a tension in the room now, but it wasn't explosive. It was quieter than that, heavier, like the kind of stillness that falls over a town just before the rain knows exactly where to land. Evelyn Katzen leaned in toward the microphone, her fingers still lightly touching the base of the stand. It had been years since someone yielded time to her. In most hearings, time was currency and she was considered a luxury. But now, the floor was hers. She glanced briefly at Jasmine Crockett, not with surprise, but with recognition. Recognition of someone who didn't just hear you. Someone who saw the whole of you. "Thank you, Congresswoman," Evelyn began softly, her voice carrying more resolve than volume. "And thank you for reminding this room that process isn't just about procedure, it's about people." She inhaled, then continued with the clarity of a woman who had spent her life choosing precision over applause. When we speak about agencies like the ATF or the EPA, it's easy to reduce them to acronyms. But behind every regulation is a person who either sleeps more safely or doesn't sleep at all. There were no camera flashes now, no raised hands, just listening. And that was Jasmine's design. She hadn't just defended Evelyn. She had shifted the gravity of the room, changed what kind of language would now carry weight. Evelyn continued, her voice steadier with each sentence. "When lawmakers say the ATF went too far, what they often mean is that the agency acted while they stalled. The agency moved when they refused to." Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. Her words had already reset the expectations for truth in the room. And then Evelyn added a line that echoed deeper than intended. "We say we want accountability, but too often we punish those who act because their actions remind us of our own inaction." There was no response. Not from across the aisle. Not from the chair. The words had already done the cutting, and Jasmine had set the table for it. She had begun with something deceptively simple, an apology. She followed it with something radical in this room, restraint. And now, she would return not to take back the spotlight, but to ensure that what followed would be remembered. When Evelyn finished, the chair signaled that her time had ended. Jasmine picked up where she left off. But her voice had changed. Not in pitch, in purpose. "You see," Jasmine began, "we've been having the wrong conversation." The words hung in the air not as judgment, but as invitation. She stood now, not for theatrics, but because the moment asked something bigger from her posture. "We've spent hours debating whether agencies are overstepping," she said, her hands still at her sides. "But we haven't asked why they had to step at all." A murmur moved across the panel, subtle, but real. Jasmine let it pass before continuing. "If Congress did its job fully, consistently, with courage, there'd be no power vacuum for the ATF or the EPA to fill. But every time we run from complexity, we leave it to someone else to carry the consequences." And then she paused, deliberate. "I don't come here today as just a legislator. I come here as someone who's lived the fallout of policy failure." The room waited. I remember when the Texas grid failed. Not from an enemy, not from sabotage, but from arrogance, from deregulation dressed up as freedom. Her voice didn't rise. Her eyes didn't blink. It was a man in East Austin, an amputee veteran. He died alone in his apartment. His oxygen ran out because the power was out. You want to talk about the cost of red tape? Let's talk about the cost of none. The weight in the room returned, but it had changed shape. It wasn't discomfort anymore. It was confrontation with reality. Jasmine stepped forward, placing a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of her. "This is a letter I received from his daughter," she said. "She wrote it 2 weeks after his funeral. She didn't ask for money. She didn't demand justice. She just asked one question. Why did no one protect us?" A beat passed. Not why did the agency fail, not why did the power company profit, but why did where government fail to protect a man who served us? She didn't read the letter. She didn't need to. She was carrying its content in her voice. "This room talks about overreach like it's a threat, but I've seen what happens when we underreach, when we pretend that regulation is tyranny and leave entire communities undefended." The silence now was no longer still. It was unsettled, shifting. And she hadn't raised her voice once. This isn't about party. It's not even about policy anymore. It's about responsibility. Her gaze swept the room, but not like a weapon, like a mirror. You say you love the Constitution. Good. Then you know it begins with a collective pronoun. We the people. Not me the politician. Not they the bureaucrats. We. She let that sit. Heavy. Unapologetic. And I know what some of you think. That my words are too emotional. That I don't sound measured enough. A slight smile touched her lips, almost ironic. I've passed more bar exams than most people in this room have passed serious legislation. I know how to be measured. But sometimes, when lives are on the line, it's not your tone that needs measuring. She looked back at Evelyn. It's your conscience. For the first time in the hearing, someone across the aisle looked down not in shame, but in reflection, and Jasmine didn't seize it. She respected it. Because her fight wasn't for humiliation. It was for transformation. In law school, they teach you that silence in court can be tactical, she said. Sometimes, it's the moment you wait for the jury to realize what you didn't say out loud. She paused again. I didn't come here to win a debate. I came here to name what's been left unnamed. Then she gestured toward Evelyn Katzen one last time. She didn't come here to defend a paycheck. She came here to defend the structure that holds us when politics fails. And instead of listening, she was targeted. A sharp exhale passed through the room. The kind that comes when the final piece of something broken is finally called by its name. She was accused of elitism, for owning a home, in a city where members of Congress hold stock in companies they're supposed to regulate. A low murmur rippled again. And still, she didn't respond with outrage. She responded with data, with patience, with what we used to call dignity. Jasmine stepped back to her seat but left one sentence hanging in the air. We ask why people don't trust government anymore. She paused. Maybe it's because they've been watching what we do with truth when it walks in quietly. And with that, she sat. No applause followed. There never is in hearings like this. But no one spoke. Not right away. Because her words had done something very few things in that room ever managed. They pierced through the ritual. They cut past the pretense. They landed. And they would stay. Not as sound bites. Not as outrage. But as something this place had forgotten how to hold. Truth sharp, calm, and final. For a long moment, no one moved. The room, the same one that had buzzed with crossfire hours earlier, was now a stillness made of something deeper than silence. It was made of memory, of accountability, of echoes that would follow every person who sat in that chamber, whether they wanted to carry them or not. Jasmine Crockett had said her final words, not with a crescendo, not with fury, but with a clarity so sharp it left the air itself trembling. And when she sat down, she didn't lean back or look around for approval. She simply exhaled. Mission complete not in conquering anyone, but in restoring what had been neglected. Truth. Not the kind that wins arguments, the kind that reminds people they're still human. Evelyn Katzen watched her quietly. There was no applause, no nods from across the aisle, no sudden shift in party alignment. But there was something more lasting than all of that. A room that now felt smaller, because the gap between what was said and what mattered had finally closed. The chairman cleared his throat, hesitant. Miss Katzen, you may offer closing remarks if you wish. She hesitated for the first time that day. Not because she lacked something to say, but because for once she didn't feel the pressure to defend herself. Jasmine had already done that. What remained now was something else. I'll be brief, Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had spent too many years being expected to be small. She looked directly into the panel, not past them, not over them, but into them. I've sat before this body more times than I can count. I've watched politics change faces, change slogans, change enemies. But what doesn't seem to change is how little room there is for nuance. A pause. What Congresswoman Crockett reminded us today is that nuance isn't weakness. It's courage. its complexity held without collapse. She took a breath. And it's the only way we'll ever write laws that outlast us. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The gavel fell once again, signaling the formal end of the session. But what no one said out loud, what every person felt, was that the real conclusion had happened minutes earlier, when the room was forced to hear what it had tried so hard to overlook. Outside, the sky had shifted. A light drizzle now touched the Capitol steps, washing the stone just enough to leave reflections. Reporters lingered by the columns, cameras ready, waiting for the usual drama shouts, walkouts, viral moments. But nothing came, because sometimes the most powerful aftermath is quiet. 3 days later, a clip from the hearing, specifically, Jasmine's 5 minutes, went viral. But not because it was explosive. It went viral because people didn't know public officials could speak like that anymore. No catchphrases, no culture war soundbites. Just a woman, standing her ground with measured fury and moral precision. The clip was reposted by teachers, by nurses, by veterans, by survivors, not because she said what they always wanted to say, but because she didn't say what they feared she might. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She didn't break. She simply told the truth in a way that couldn't be edited out of history. In the days that followed, Evelyn received a stack of handwritten letters, actual letters, not emails, not tweets, people asking her to keep showing up. Not because she had won the debate, but because she had endured it without folding. One letter stood out. It was from a former staffer on the committee, someone Evelyn had never met personally. It read, "I was in the back row that day. I've worked here 8 years, and I've never heard someone yield time so someone else could finish their truth. You reminded me why I came to this job in the first place." It was signed only with initials. But Evelyn kept that letter taped to the inside of her briefcase. Not because it made her feel important, but because it made her feel seen. In a closed-door meeting the following week, one of the senior committee members, a Republican from the Midwest, referenced the hearing. He didn't praise Jasmine by name, but he paused before suggesting that perhaps we've lost sight of how we treat witnesses. That was as close to an admission as anyone would get. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't need the credit. She had planted something more enduring than applause. A discomfort. A mirror. An echo that couldn't be dismissed as partisan noise. Months later, Jasmine would give a keynote speech at a conference on legislative integrity. She didn't mention the hearing directly, but she told a story about her mother, how she used to whisper prayers instead of speaking them out loud because she believed God paid more attention when words weren't shouted. Jasmine closed that speech with a single sentence. When the country forgets how to listen, it doesn't need a microphone. It needs a moment of stillness with someone who remembers why words matter. The audience stood in silence before applauding, not because they were told to, but because they didn't know what else to do with the feeling in their chest. And as for Evelyn Katzen, she kept testifying. She never raised her voice, never changed her style, but something had changed nonetheless. Now, when she walked into a hearing room, there was a new kind of awareness. People remembered her not as the woman who got interrupted, but as the woman who finished her sentence after the room finally made space. And that, perhaps, was the most lasting echo of all. She didn't have to win to be remembered. She just had to endure long enough for the right voice to say, "You matter." And now, no one could pretend she didn't. Because the words Jasmine Crockett left behind didn't fade with the hearing. They traveled into committee rooms, into court transcripts, into classrooms, into the quiet resolve of public servants who kept showing up even when the spotlight never turned their way. The truth didn't need to raise its voice, because once spoken with dignity, it echoes in places microphones can't reach. And that they can't escape. Not today. Not ever. Have you ever sat in a room where your presence felt tolerated, but not truly welcomed? Have you ever watched others speak over you not because you were wrong, but because they never planned to listen in the first place? If you have, you're not alone. What we witnessed today wasn't just about policy or politics, it was about dignity, about what happens when someone chooses calm over chaos and truth over noise, about the quiet power of finishing your sentence, even if someone else tried to steal your breath. And maybe the most important reminder is this: you don't have to be the loudest voice to make history. You just have to stay rooted in your truth and wait for the moment the room finally remembers how to hear it. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you stood your ground with nothing but grace, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's been interrupted too often, with someone who's afraid their voice won't matter, and maybe with someone who needs to hear what restraint can look like when it's powered by purpose. If you found meaning in this story, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell stories that aren't always loud but always true. And I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments below. What part of this resonated with you? Because here, your voice won't just be heard. It'll be honored. The truth didn't need to raise its voice, because once spoken with dignity, it echoes in places microphones can't reach. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.